Here we want to say a few words on indulgences to clear up the confusion. There's some idea, that's come up. Most everyone has at least heard of indulgences in the Christian or Catholic circles, but the question of what they are is way up in the air. A lot of people have this idea that it has something to do with money, of buying and selling salvation, right? This whole idea, is this a fact or a myth, right? It comes from maybe a corrupt idea that happened in the early 1500s, 1400s, 1600s, but is it something that still holds today? Most people still think, oh, indulgence with a negative term. What the heck is it, right? So what we want to look at is, fact or myth. What's the fact? What's the myth? What's this all coming from? So that we can clear up the confusion, okay? So indulgences. Our first thing that we want to look at when we talk about indulgences is starting with sins, forgiveness, authority, right? The big confusion is salvation, right? Sins, right? So the first thing, Christ gave the church the authority to forgive sins, right? We've seen it in multiple places. It tells Peter, binding and loosing. He tells the apostles on the day of the resurrection, whose sins you forgive are forgiven, whose sins you retain are retained, right? We recognize then the church has the authority for forgiveness of sins. The church doesn't on a whim say your sins are forgiven or yours, right? It's Christ's authority handed on to be acted in the name of Christ under, right, Christ's guidance, right? We recognize this in the sacrament of reconciliation. That's what takes place, right? In reconciliation, somebody goes to the priest who is in the person of Christ, right? They confess their sins, necessary element for the priest to be able, in his authority given to him, handed down from the bishops, from the apostles, from Christ, to say, your sins are forgiven, right? The authority for forgiveness of guilt and remission of eternal punishment. That's what we're talking about, right? In reconciliation. Okay, that's what's given. And so it's recognized that the authority to forgive and remit temporal punishment from those sins is also there. Whoa, what are we talking about? Okay, reconciliation, right? What's going on? There's a forgiveness of guilt and a remission of eternal punishment, right? What happens? John Smith goes to confession. There's the priest in the person of Christ, right? He confesses his sin, right? The priest, right, says through the authority that I have, right, I give absolution. That is, right, forgiveness of the guilt of sins. Your sins are forgiven. And the eternal punishment, hell, right, no more, right? And usually you leave with a little penance to be done, right? And you have a clean soul. You feel good. You're jumping up and down with joy because you just went through the spiritual car wash, right? That's what's going on. So if that's taking place, right, it's also recognized, right, that not only if the priest has the authority for forgiveness of eternal punishment, bye-bye hell, right, the authority also to remit temporal punishment for the sins is also there. The big question is, what does this mean and where do we see it, right? So we'll talk about that in a second. Make sure we know all this comes from what? From the merits of Christ's paschal mystery, right? From Christ's passion, death, and resurrection, he shows that he is God. He has the ability to forgive sins, and he gives that authority on the night of the resurrection, right? The day he shows that he is truly divine to the apostles. That is, to the beginning of his church, for them to dish out to the rest of the world, all the way down to 2014. So let's continue on. The Catholic Encyclopedia makes the saying a little bit clearer. It talks about baptism. Think about this. Baptism, what happens? When one goes through the waters of baptism, here's our dude, right? He goes through the waters of baptism, right? The guilt of sin is remitted, right? But also this person, right, after going through baptism, the penalties attached to sin are gone, right? So after baptism, you die on the way up to the big man, right? There you go. Heaven is awaiting you, right? So somebody after 30 years of pagan practices and sin, right, who finds Jesus and is baptized, receives true forgiveness of sin, right? And they are without that stain, right? They are, in one sense, holy before they start sinning after baptism. There it is, right? So clear this up. The guilt of sin is remitted. You're forgiven for your sin. The penalties, right? You're clean. Gone through the car wash, attached to the sin, gone. Well, penance is similar but different. In penance, you also have the guilt of sin that's removed, yes. But the eternal punishment also removed, yes, that's due to mortal sin, but there still remains this temporal punishment. So there's a difference. Make sure we get this. There's an eternal punishment, hell, right? There's a temporal punishment, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. Remaining. Required by divine justice, there's a temporal punishment too. So we'll talk about that in a second, give good examples. But this requirement that you still have temporal punishment required by justice, right, to be served, that has to be served either, right, in the world to come, that is purgatory, right, because you're not perfectly clean when you're dying, when you're dead in heaven, or in the present life. Okay. Indulgence, what does it do? It offers the penitent sinner the means of discharging this temporal punishment during his life on earth, not in death, right? Let's give some examples, real world. Okay, again, after one receives the sacrament of reconciliation, the guilt of sin is forgiven, but the temporal punishment remains. So, example, real world. First of all, one steals a car and is forgiven of his sins, right? There's contrition, he says, I'm sorry, right? He's forgiven by the guy that he stole the car from. But not only is he forgiven, he still has to repay, right? There's still some kind of temporal reparation. He's returning the car and must return at least the value of the car, right? Otherwise, is there true forgiveness? And otherwise, is there true reconciliation, right? So there's two aspects, right? There's the actual forgiveness of the guilt, and then there's the temporal punishment, the reparation to repair and to right the wrong and to bring it back to how it was. Another example, a guy cheats on his wife. He can be forgiven, right? His wife may say, I forgive you. But is that relationship perfect right then, just as it was before the sin took place? Well, no, right? Here's man and here's his wife, right? When that sin happens, what do you have? You have a big rift, right? She says, I forgive, right? But there's still this rift, right, that needs maybe time, right? There's still a scar and a wound. There's still consequences to the actions. That is, there's a trust issue, right? And so time needs to heal it, right? You need to do some things, right? Show her that you're loving, that you can be trusted once again, right? Again, there's the guilt that's forgiven, but then there's also, right, the temporal punishment, the wound, and the time that has to happen to repair it, to bring it back into right relationship, right? Lastly, for you guys, good example to fit in, one who cheats on a test, right? Even after you're caught, maybe they apologize, you apologize to your teacher, right? Even with true contrition and the teacher saying, I really forgive you, still there's a damage between the relationship between the teacher and the student, right? They still receive a 0 on the test, even though there's forgiveness that takes place. And, right, there's still a real amount of time, we'll call this the punishment, right, the temporal punishment, that has to happen to mend the relationship, right, for it to be brought back to how it was before the sin, right? So the temporal punishment is that stuff that takes place, make sure you have this down, after forgiveness, right? Even after forgiveness now takes time to heal a wound, right? That's called the temporal punishment. All right, let's continue on then. So there's a myth today that indulgence has to do with buying forgiveness, right? That's the myth. Well, here's the deal. Indulgences don't have anything to do with buying forgiveness. Indulgences presuppose that a sin has already been forgiven. That's key. Mark that, highlight that. Understand that. So when you talk about indulgences in the church, indulgences assume that you have contrition and there's been forgiveness, right? You've gone through the sacrament of reconciliation. God has forgiven your sin. Indulgences then recognize that now that that's taken place, there is still that time needed, which is called that temporal punishment, to heal our relationship with God, right? That has truly been damaged, okay? Think about a friendship that is wounded. Can you buy forgiveness from your friend? Can you buy forgiveness from your friend? No, right? Your friend may say, I forgive you, right? But the punishment, that is the wound or the scar in the relationship, still remains, right? How is it healed? If you do something, if you cause some harm to your friendship and your friend, how is that healed? It's healed over time. It's healed with love. It's healed by your desire to bring it back, and it's healed by you showing, right, that you care, right? So there is that temporal punishment, and there is that real time that takes to heal it, to bring it back after, again, your friend has forgiven you. That's key. We're going to keep highlighting it. Okay, so what is an indulgence then? Get rid of the myth, and here's the fact. It is remission before God of the temporal punishment due to sin, whose guilt has, highlight, underline, has already been forgiven. Let's say that one more time. Remission before God of temporal punishment, removal of temporal punishment due to sin, whose guilt has already been forgiven. Okay, so we're dealing with not sins that haven't been forgiven, but sins where you have contrition, you have forgiveness that's taken place. What an indulgence is not comes from the Catholic Encyclopedia. It's not a permission to commit sin. It's not a pardon for future sins. Neither could it be granted by any power. It's not the forgiveness of guilt of sin, right? It supposes that the sin has already been forgiven, as we said. It's not an exemption from any law or duty, much less from the obligation of certain kinds of sin. It's not restitution, right? It's a means, more complete payment of a debt. That's what it is, which the sinner owes to God, right? That's what it is. Okay. It does not confer immunity from temptation, right? It doesn't prevent you from being tempted later or remove the possibility of subsequent lapses into sin, right? That's not what an indulgence is. Least of all is an indulgence the purchase of a pardon, which secures the buyer's salvation or releases the soul of another from purgatory. Say that last part again. Least of all, it is not the purchase of a pardon which secures your buyer's salvation, right? The error, taking out proper disposition. The error, taking out the heart, right? Just thinking you can just do something to gain salvation. All right. Who's it available to? It's available to members of the faithful under certain conditions prescribed by the church. That is, the church gives an official list, right? Do these things, right? Usually prayer, devotions, pilgrimage, acts of charity, or combinations of it all with, of course, reconciliation. And highlight, it is always has to be done with the proper disposition. It's not just doing something as payment. Again, so temporal punishment, the time spent after death in purgatory, the state of purification for those saved on their way to heaven. What are we talking about? Removing that time and spending that time now. Doing something now to right the relationship. That's what we're talking about. All right. There are two types of indulgence. Partial indulgence, removing part of punishment. Plenary indulgence, removing all that punishment. All right. Clearing it up. So, last thoughts on indulgence. It's not a sale of anything. Put it clearly and simply, it's the church giving official list of things to do that can guarantee, if done correctly, rightly, with the right heart and intention, you can guarantee you are growing in holiness, moving towards God, right, and righting the damage that has happened from sin. That's the idea of indulgence. So indulgences are good things that can be done to bring us into holiness, to remove that wound that happens from sin. Temporal punishment is what we call it. The error from all the myths comes from the idea that people can give people money to do something or abuse an indulgence and take out proper disposition or confuse what it really is. Those are the two errors when it comes to indulgence.